We're ready to have our last conversation of this wonderful event. I hope you've enjoyed lunch and had some good networking time, and thank you all very much again for coming. This is our lunchtime speaker or conversation, Senator Michael Bennet from Colorado. He is, somebody's giving me the note. Two of our leaders to learn from Colorado, which I knew, of course.
Hello.
Yeah, that's right.
Welcome. Take me home with you.
Might be constituents, some of you will recall that Senator Bennet himself was the superintendent of the Denver Public Schools not all that long ago. And as superintendent, Michael Bennet led a bold and inclusive reform effort that improved student achievement in the urban district, helping turn around failing schools, and ended a cycle of annual budget cuts. In 2008, for the first time in 5 years, the district did not have to cut its budget, and a year later, the district invested an additional $18 million in its schools and expanded its early childhood education offerings. In the Senate, which is where he lives now, his committee assignments include the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, or HELP, where he continues to be active in education issues. So that's what we are going to talk about. We had Deb, and now we're going to have Senator Bennet talk about what's going on in Washington and otherwise. So what's it been like overall to go from being a school superintendent to a senator in the U.S.
It's been a big
Senate?
transition. I can't actually believe this, but I've been in the Senate longer than I was the superintendent. But for a variety of reasons, it's been a transition. I think the superintendency that I had will be the best job I will ever have.
Deb said the same thing.
I loved it. And I'm still, I call at least once a month my successor, Tom Boasberg. I've noticed he never calls me, ever, for advice, but I call him frequently just to check in on how the reform is continuing. I used to spend a lot of time when I was superintendent wondering why people in Washington were so mean to our kids and to our teachers. And now that I've spent some time here, it turns out they're really not mean. They're pretty well-intentioned, but they have absolutely no idea what's going on in our schools or our classrooms, no conception of it at all. And that makes policymaking difficult.
So do you feel like you've brought some lessons from that superintendency?
I hope so. I mean, the perspective that I have is that we need to insist on success, and we need to expect success and figure out how we hold ourselves to a very high standard across the country. But we shouldn't be in the business of telling people from Washington, D.C. how to reach that success, which is the way I felt when I was superintendent. And in fact, it's the way I felt about our schools. In other words, if you read back then, Ed Week, not now, but back then, what you would read is that autonomy was something to be earned by school leaders and by teachers. Yep. And it was something to be, you had to demonstrate success and you would earn autonomy. I actually see it in exactly the opposite way, which is autonomy ought to be the state of nature, and it's something that you lose if you don't perform. But if you're performing, we shouldn't be telling you how to do it a different way. And I feel the same way about the way we frame the ESCA, or No Child Left Behind.
Well, let's drill down on that a little bit. And what would you say is the appropriate federal role in education, particularly K through 12, but pre-K through 12?
So first of all, I think actually it's pre-K through whatever, higher ed
yep.
and career. And one of the problems that we have is that we still are, that's very siloed still. And I know, I've sat where many of you are sitting now. I remember I used to walk, when I first became superintendent of the Denver Public Schools, I was subject to a lot of criticism because I had no background in K-12 education. People say, you don't know anything about K-12 education. They were actually right about that. But I had spent a lot of time in my life dealing with budgets in the private sector and in the public sector. And I carried around the Denver Public Schools budget for 6 weeks. I took it on airplanes with me. And I couldn't understand it. I couldn't make heads or tails of it until I realized that what I was reading was not a budget in the sense that I understood it, a management document, but it was a compliance tool. That's what it was about. And that's what it still is about in school districts all over the country, not so much in Denver anymore. So You know, I think the appropriate federal role is to expect a lot, as I said earlier, but stop telling people how to spend their money, stop telling people that they've got to comply with 8 gazillion regulations, and instead just hold people to a higher standard. And I would say also, we've got a vital national interest in figuring out how we're going to replace the more than 1 million teachers that we're going to lose over the next 7 years, and we have absolutely no theory about how we're going to do that. And we've got to, I think where we can, since we're only 9% of the overall spend on K-12 education, I think the federal government has a role to play in supporting innovation, you know, in our school districts and the replication of that innovation.
So we talked about it a little earlier with Assistant Secretary Delisle about the use of competitive grants. You're in favor of that.
I'm in favor of it, but we have to figure out that I think small rural school districts have a very legitimate complaint here. Very legitimate complaint that they don't have the grant writing capacity to be able to compete for these grants, and we have to find a way to address that. I strongly support the competitive grant programs like Raise the Top and others because I think that it allows people with imagination in the field to be able to make their case, to outcompete others, and then be able to demonstrate whether they can be a success or not.
So how do you square equity concerns? I mean, rural districts are one cut on that.
Right. We have to figure out how to do that. I mean, the rural part of this is not easy. This is not a trivial issue, and it's something that we've got to figure out. I think equity generally is really important. It's one of the reasons why I wrote the bill that would close the comparability loophole. I won't bore you with what that is, except to say that we are, even though you don't believe this is true, I will tell you it is, we are one of 3 OECD countries in the world that spend more money on our more affluent students than we do on our poor students in this country. And if you have any interest in closing the achievement gap, that seems to me to be exactly the opposite of the way we ought to spend it. But equity can't mean keeping the system the same. You know, it can't mean that you can't change it, because we have to change it if we're ever going to live in a place where more than 9 out of 100 poor kids are graduating with a college degree or the equivalent of a college degree. I mean, it's just not a sustainable set of outcomes.
So what are the couple policy levers the federal part of the government system can put into play for ensuring equity?
Well, I think the comparability loophole would be the most important thing. I think that's the most important thing.
Well, say a little more about what that, from the feds.
I'll tell you, so essentially, from the 60s onward, we have not permitted, but required states and school districts to report their expenditures based on average teacher salary, not on actual teacher salary. And what that means is that if you're a school, if you're let's say a high poverty school, not always true, but as a general matter, your teachers tend to be newer than teachers that are in a more affluent school because of the way the system works.
Yep.
So that school is being billed, is being charged as though it's paying an average teacher salary, okay?
Yep.
When in fact, it's paying less than that because it's paying newer teachers. Affluent school is being charged that average salary when in fact they're paying this much in salaries and pensions. So there's this massive subsidy going from poorer schools to more wealthy schools in the country. That's very poorly understood. It's a good illustration, though, of how the lack of facts, you know, inform or misinform the policy debate that we're having here. To go back to an earlier observation about this place.
Mm-hmm. And what's another policy lever that the feds can help?
One of the things that I was just last week in Denver, or the week before, visiting Gust Elementary School, because I wanted to see the build-out of something I started but was not there to begin, which is called the Denver Teacher Residency Program, which is a residency-based model that we're doing with the University of Denver, graduate level. We're now going to move into undergraduate levels. And I think the federal government could support that kind of work. They support residency-based programs to train new teachers and to bring mid-career switchers into teaching. The teachers in that room, one of whom was a 5-year teacher. She'd been in the first first cohort of the program. 5 years later, she's now a master teacher, being a mentor in the program, being paid to do that work. And the majority of the teachers that were there were people that were actually switching from other careers. You know, it said I was an advertiser, and I didn't want to do it anymore. And I looked up the Denver Teacher Residency Program. I think there's real promise here. And I'll just on that subject, because it doesn't have to do with the federal level, but just on that subject, people ask me a lot, you know, what makes a good school? And I always say it's not, you know, not one thing, it's lots and lots of things. But one thing that I think is elemental and fundamental is that if a school becomes a place where it's not just about teaching kids, although that's the principal reason, but not just about kids learning, but also about the adults getting better at their job every single day that they're there, that they are doing it themselves, professional development themselves, you know, class to class, day by day, week by week. That's going to be a good school if it's got a great principal and great teachers. It'll be a good school. And that model, I think, is also very attractive to people that might think about teaching but don't want to do it in the traditional way. So that's an example, too, of a place where you can inject innovation, some competition, and we now have higher ed partners that I never would have imagined would have come to say, we want a piece of this action, who are coming to DPS now and saying, we want a piece of that action. Help us understand how we can build a model like that.
So what's your prediction of when HEA and ESEA will get reauthorized?
Well, I think, you know, on ESEA, which is No Child Left Behind for all of you, you know, if you had a rally tomorrow on the steps of the Capitol to keep No Child Left Behind the same, keep No Child Left Behind the same, not a single person would come to that. Yet it's been 7 years since it was supposed to be reauthorized, and we still haven't reauthorized it. I don't know what it's going to take. I mean, I don't think it's going to happen, and you know, it's certainly not going to happen this year. Higher ed maybe has a better chance sooner.
Within this administration?
I think higher ed's possibly within this administration. I think ESCA, no.
So let's talk a little bit about the politics. Senator Bennet, you are the head of the Senate Democratic what's it called? The campaign committee, which is helping to get Democrats elected to the Senate. There's a lot of pushback out there right now on the administration on certain fronts, including education. What keeps you up at night there?
On the education front, I mean, I think that...
With respect to the politics.
Well, actually, less so the politics than the... There's enough to keep me up at night on the politics that I don't have to worry about education in that regard, because every newspaper you read says we're going to lose. Yeah. I don't actually agree with that, but that's not... But what does keep me up at night is the political assault on high standards for our kids. And we have been kidding ourselves as a country for a very long time, and it's really important that we don't shortchange people that are coming after us by either having low standards or no standards, as some would advocate. You know, there are people in this town that say the founding father, or version of this, the founding fathers didn't want the federal government involved in education at all, and that we shouldn't, you know, we shouldn't concern ourselves with education. I don't know. That's an argument of, you know, federal versus state. What I do know is we have a vital national interest in making sure we don't perpetuate a system that's generating, you know, 9 college graduates out of 100 poor kids. We have a vital national interest in figuring out how to update a system that hasn't changed since we had a labor market that discriminated against women and said, you've got 2 professional choices, one's being a teacher, one's being a nurse. How about come teach Julius Caesar for 30 years of your life in the Denver Public Schools? We have a vital national interest in that, in making sure that teaching's something that people want to do and feel supported in. And we're not doing it. So neither of those are political concerns, but they are deep, substantive concerns about getting our act together here. If all you do is take the academic achievement outcomes that we see and extrapolate those outcomes over the changing demographics in this country, we are not going to recognize ourselves in the middle of the 21st century if we keep doing what we're doing.
So people
we're just not.
You know, there's a lot of talk about the, you know, education that was better in the past, and the frame is a negative one. I'll just stop there. What has to happen to build public will and public demand for these better schools and better outcomes for kids?
It's very, very hard. It's very hard to do, and it's very hard to do You know, in a sense, I feel like we cheated. I wouldn't say it that way. We were lucky because the school district I was running was 73,000 kids, you know, in 150 schools. And you really could feel like you could drape your arms around that and change the political weather and the political environment to be able to build the case for both for reform, but also why this was an important public good that we had to get figured out. And I'll tell you something, you know, that has continued. The people that are leading the effort now there have done a much better job than I ever did. And today, we have 86,000 kids in the Denver Public Schools. It is the fastest growing urban school district in the country, and it is now the largest school district in Colorado again, which it hadn't been for many, many years, because we have lost kids year after year after year since the advent of busing, and our response to that was to just make cuts and to diminish the academic environment for kids, which created a self-fulfilling prophecy. We got some budget stuff straightened out. You mentioned it in the opening. We closed a bunch of schools. We had 40% too much capacity for the number of kids that we had because nobody wanted to close schools. We dealt with a pension issue that I won't bore you with, and all of a sudden we actually had some stability. And on that stability, we were able to build a portfolio of school choices all across the district at elementary and secondary levels both that were attractive to families again, which is why we're seeing the growth that we're seeing there. I don't know how I would do it in a district of 1 million kids. You know, before I became superintendent in Denver, I said, and again, back when I didn't know anything about K-12, they asked me, well, what are you going to do? What makes you so special? And I used to say when I was there that our reform was breathtaking in its lack of originality. But the one commitment I made at the beginning that I feel was the single most important thing we did is I said, I'm going to start every single day with a group of 15 of our principals. So every 3 weeks, I will see every principal in the school district for at least 2 hours, and that's what I did. And I'd sit there with my chief academic officer, a wonderful guy named Jaime Aquino, and, you know, I remember one in particular. We'd have a 1.5 page piece of student writing by a 4th grader in Denver. And Jaime would hand it out, and there'd be, you know, sort of muttering and then a crescendo, and Jaime would say, okay, based on what, and they would say, I can't read this doesn't make sense, this looks like a foreign language, I don't know what this is. By the way, this was our antidote for not saying, it's really important for you to look at student work. Go tell your teachers to look at student work. And they knew I was sitting there every day for 3 weeks with this same piece of student work. And so they'd say, well, we can't read that. And Jaime would say, based on what you've read, what are Nancy's strengths as a writer? And then they'd have an hour-long conversation that at the beginning was really painful, really painful. But over the course of it, you know, they'd say, well, she writes from left to right. She has some sense of story structure. She spells high-frequency words correctly. And we'd say, well, why is that? They'd say, well, maybe she had a vocabulary test. And we'd say, maybe, or maybe her teacher has a word wall that she's using to scaffold her instruction. We don't know, so don't make an assumption. And the point is, I guess, I'm sorry to get off on that, but the point is that helped us create an environment, too, where people felt aligned, committed to the effort, and I think still are. What we suffer from in education, and we suffer from this in other places too, but it's particularly tough here, and it's why what you're doing is so important today, is we, you know, often implement things very poorly. And when you implement things poorly, particularly when it's change, the folks that want to keep things the same have a great argument.
So I said last night, I got it twisted, but the idea of a good program implemented poorly is much worse than a poor program implemented well. That took a while for my head to get wrapped.
It's absolutely true, and I'll tell you, it's true on every level, and a particular place with education that's important is it's particularly true with curriculum. And you think about what the general view of, you know, your average superintendent in a district like mine lasts 22 months or something like that. And the ritual is that the first thing the new guy does is they come in to put in the new curriculum to prove they're not the old guy. And then they stay there, and scores either go up a little and they leave and go to a bigger district, they fall a little, they go to a smaller district, but in any event, 22 months later, they get fired because the scores aren't going up. The next guy comes in, does another curriculum, And that's what creates this incredible fatigue, completely understandable fatigue, out in a workforce that's saying, stop doing this to me. And we got to get to a place where people actually feel like we're doing it with them, and that we're worried much more about quality of implementation and quality of folks.
And capacity.
And capacity of people than we are about the shiny, bright object.
So I'm on a clock here. I'm going to ask you two quick questions. Where are you on teacher evaluation? You worked with your union in Denver, and you had a lot of thinking on that.
Yep. I support teacher evaluation. I actually am not one of those people that feels like it has to be a requirement of a successful ESCA law, because I don't oppose that necessarily, but what I know is that what we will achieve if we do that is 10 years of really lousy teacher evaluation systems all across the United States. This is another place where maybe we should be thinking about using funds to incentivize people to do it rather than telling them that they have to do it.
And the message of a positive frame, I hate to sound like a Pollyanna, versus a punitive or deficit kind of approach to it.
I think, look, I long ago gave up the idea that in this field of work that you could get much done in a command and control approach, even at the school district level. Because the work is being done in the classroom. That's the unit. You know, that's even a more refined unit than the school.
Yep.
And it's being done in a place where a teacher is trying to differentiate her instruction to meet the individual needs of the kids in the classroom. You can't solve that through edicts. And what you got to do is get people to agree on what the plan of action is, and then hold them accountable to very high goals about how we're going to get there together. And you need a system in place that actually measures the right things, not the wrong things.
I was going to have Senator Bennett make a final comment, but I think that was a wonderful ending. I'm past time, so let's thank him for taking time out. Thank you very much. That was great.
Thanks so very much. You guys can just exit out off the stage that way. That would be just great. Feel free to take off to your right, I guess. As there are with so many live events, there are those who we need to thank who played integral roles behind the scenes. You may not have seen them today, but without them, this event would, and their amazing work, make this event amazing. I'd like to give a special thanks to all the staff at Education Week. Many of you are back at the office, so thank you very much for the incredible work you put in today, and many of them are in the room today, so thank you for all of your work. Thank you again for the leaders here, this incredible group of leaders from 2014, and many of the ones from 2013 who were able to join us today. Pardon me. Thanks for this terrific day of celebration and inspiration. I think it's rare that we as a paper get to do that, and it's great that we get to be able to share such excellent examples of programs well implemented. I want to say goodbye to our online audience. Thank you guys for joining us very much. Everyone online and here in the room can find out more about all of these leaders. I want to encourage you all to read the special report, which is online at edweek.org/leaders. It's also there that you and everyone in this room, everyone, all 600, 700 of you online, can nominate next year's Leaders to Learn From. I want to encourage you to do so. I'm sure you know great examples in your districts and schools all across this country, so we want to know what they are. Go to edweek.org/leaders. For those of you in the room, again, a quick reminder, we do want your feedback on the evaluation forms. Please fill these out and bring them to the front. And finally, goodbye from Washington. Thank you for watching. And we'll see you again next year for more Leaders to Learn From.